Now, our first session of the day is our political keynote, followed by a facilitated fireside chat. And this political keynote will be delivered by Nicola Willis, who is currently National's Deputy Leader, spokesperson for Finance and Social Investment. She's also a member of Parliament's Finance and Expenditure Select Committee and the Intelligence and Security Select Committee. And she's previously served on the Environment Select Committee, the Education and Workforce Select Committee, and the Regulations Review Select Committee. Donna, I think that's almost as many committees as we have at the FSC, and we've got a lot of committees.
Yeah, almost, Riz. And Rachel Smalley. Rachel has spent more than 2 decades working across all media platforms: digital, television, radio and print. The majority of her career has been in broadcasting, working as a foreign correspondent, senior anchor and producer for a number of international and domestic news channels. Rachel was based in Europe for several years, reporting on many globally significant events, including political elections in France and Britain, and was in Washington, DC in 2008, reporting on Barack Obama's historic election to the White House. Let's first welcome Nicola to the stage.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. It is my pleasure to be speaking with you today, the leaders of New Zealand's financial service providers. Since I became National's finance spokesperson, I've really enjoyed meeting many of you whose eyes I can see in the crowd, and I'm looking forward to getting to know more of you in the months ahead. Let me start simply by saying that National values your contribution to New Zealand. Your work supports the financial security of families and businesses across the country, whether by helping people grow their retirement nest egg, providing them financial advice, or giving them the peace of mind afforded by insurance. National shares your desire to see Kiwis better off and for this to be an economy that is more productive, sustainable, and prosperous. And we share your concerns, I'm sure, about the cost of living crisis, with prices rising faster than in 32 years, declining real wages, acute worker shortages, and too many New Zealanders lacking confidence about their economic future. Now, we in this room, I think, all understand that some of the challenges facing New Zealand are outside our direct control. Geopolitical tensions, climate change, and supply chain challenges are our reality. What's also true, however, is that government decision-making over the next few years will have an enormous influence on how well New Zealand can cope with these challenges. We can't control the sea in which we sail, but we can steer the boat. And now, more than ever, government must provide careful economic management that gets the basics right, taking care not to add unnecessary costs, reducing regulatory and policy barriers that choke growth and innovation, ensuring government spending is disciplined and delivers results, squarely focusing the Reserve Bank on price stability, and ensuring we do not overtax New Zealanders. So what does that all mean for your industry? It means National wants to work alongside you to deliver better results for the New Zealanders we serve. Today, I would like to briefly set out 2 key areas where National will take a different approach than the current government. They are the nature and scale of regulation and the proposed income insurance scheme. First, we will take a much more careful approach to government regulation and red tape. In recent years, well-intended but poorly executed regulation has imposed massive costs on New Zealand. I know the financial services sector knows all about it. Waves of new requirements from overlapping regulators with seemingly no coordination and a complete absence of strategic coherence. Too often, those who have been consulted about proposed changes have had their insights ignored, with great costs created as a result. The complex regulations created under the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act, our little friend, the CCCFA, are a case in point. Well-intended legislation sabotaged by heavy-handed, prescriptive regulations that ended up choking mortgage lending and consumer credit. Those badly designed regulations had a massive human cost, and we should not forget that. I have spoken to too many distressed prospective home buyers who gave up on their home ownership dream in the wake of the CCCFA changes. And yes, I know the government has backtracked to fix the worst of it, but how much better would it have been to listen to the people in this room in the first place? And is it any wonder that so many business leaders ask me, what is the point in the endless rounds of consultations and submissions if government officials don't actually want to listen to what we have to say? The Kiwisaver tax debacle was another example. In that case, I know fund managers explicitly warned officials of the impact proposed GST changes would have on fees, contributions, and Kiwisaver fund balances, gently, diplomatically suggesting that New Zealanders would be unlikely to welcome it. Again, the submissions were ignored until it was too late, with the eventual policy back down as inevitable as it was avoidable. The good news is that a better way is possible. National sees big potential productivity gains with a smarter, more coordinated approach to financial sector regulation, genuine engagement with industry, and simpler reporting frameworks. And I know that my colleague Andrew Bailey has worked closely with many of the people in this room on the detail of that. We want your industry spending more of your time innovating for the betterment of New Zealanders and less of your time navigating red tape. I'll turn now to the government's proposed taxpayer-funded income insurance scheme. I understand it's been a topic of discussion over the past day or so. So let me be upfront. National opposes it. It's a solution looking for a problem, a threat to New Zealand's economy, and a tax on jobs. The income insurance scheme proposed by the government would pay people 80% of their wage for up to 6 months after they lost their job, a sort of gold-plated social welfare scheme. Now let's remember, New Zealand already has a well-functioning social welfare safety net for people who lose their jobs, and it also has a private sector offering income protection insurance. The system we have today operates on a simple assumption that people who can work should. Work is about more than income. It is a source of identity, relationships, and dignity. For many years, successive New Zealand governments have therefore operated our welfare system on the principle that in order to encourage those who can work to seek and stay in work, we should always ensure paid work is more lucrative than welfare. The government's proposed income insurance scheme would threaten that principle by creating a far more generous taxpayer-funded welfare system for a select group of New Zealanders. It would encourage some workers to stay out of work longer than they otherwise would, trapped by the golden handcuffs of 80% pay with no obligations. Not only would this scheme add complexity to our existing system, it would also, in the words of the Salvation Army, result in a two-tiered approach to welfare that is more likely to increase inequalities than reduce them. Economists point out, of course, that similar schemes around the world have resulted in damaging effects. increasing the number of unemployed people, increasing how long people stay unemployed, reducing people's incomes, and adding more pressure to inflation. Put simply, the proposed scheme would be bad for New Zealand's economy. It would create a lose-lose situation for workers and employers by keeping workers out of the workforce for longer than would otherwise be the case. And that's actually, of course, not an unintended outcome of the idea. It's exactly what it's designed to make possible. And this intent to National seems totally at odds with the emerging shortage of workers and skills that demographics suggest will persist and potentially intensify in the years ahead. What's more, the government's proposed scheme would cost an eye-watering $3.5 billion every year. In fact, some experts do suggest that those numbers could underestimate the full extent of the cost. But just for context, $3.5 billion is far more than the entire annual budget provided to the New Zealand Police. It is a huge amount of money. So how does the government intend to fund it? You guessed it, with a new tax, the jobs tax, a tax on every worker and a tax on every employer. The new jobs tax of 1.39% would be levied on every worker every year and every employer every year. National has gone and crunched the numbers. The tax would make a typical worker earning a median wage $834 worse off a year. $834 worse off for a policy you probably never asked for. $834, so some people can stay out of work on better pay for longer. $834 less for your groceries, your bills, and your own savings. That's before we count the cost to employers. They would also be hit by a 1.39% wage tax for every employee on their payroll. For a small business with 10 employees on median wages, that would add $7,200 to the annual tax bill. That's $7,200 that would no longer be available for pay rises, for new staff, or new investments. It's another cost for business that would be passed on in higher prices for New Zealanders. So workers would wear the financial burden of the jobs tax twice, once in more direct tax and second in higher prices. Our country simply can't afford that sort of policy. Now, I know some in this room have suggested that the government could draw on your expertise as it designs the scheme. After all, many of you already provide income protection schemes for New Zealanders, and good on you for providing those products. However, I don't think you should hold your breath that the government will partner with the private sector on this. The Finance Minister has already allocated $60 million to ACC to develop the scheme. So National's position on the proposed income insurance scheme is clear. We oppose it. We oppose the jobs tax needed to fund it, and we are calling on the government to drop it. Our commitment is clear. If the government does press ahead and implement the jobs tax, we will repeal it. Now, more than ever, New Zealand needs sensible economic policies that strengthen our fundamentals, not weaken them. This is no time for an experimental new scheme that New Zealand workers cannot afford. So in closing, let me thank you once again for your contribution to our country. National views you and your businesses as vital partners in the New Zealand project. There is a great future available for our country. The task now is to make it happen. And I look forward to your questions about how we do that. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Morena, good morning. Nicola, I was going to ask you how you felt about the income insurance scheme, but I think I've made my views quite clear. Yeah, absolutely. I know Business New Zealand has been involved in this as well and shaping it. Is it about the scheme itself or is it about the timing, do you think?
Look, it is about both. We do have real worries, as I said, about the incentives that such a scheme creates and the second tier it creates in the welfare system. But we also think it's completely the wrong time to be adding those extra costs for workers. And we do really worry. I mean, one of the major concerns that businesses raise with me while I go around the country is the lack of workers and the concern that that worker shortage could persist if current immigration patterns continue. So it just seems to me that into the future, we're going to want people who are out of work back in the workforce as quickly as possible. So why stop that happening with a scheme like that?
Okay, I want to talk to you a little bit of an umbrella view here, because if National is elected into government, you're walking into a very different political environment from which the party left. And I'm talking about economically and socially on so many issues, our health service, on immigration, and it's a very divided society, I think, post-COVID. As far as, if you saw this job advertised on Seek, I don't think you'd probably grab it with both hands.
Yeah.
What do you think you'll be inheriting if you are elected later next year? What sort of shape do you think you'll be, the economy will be in?
Look, I think if I saw the job on Seek, I'd say it's a turnaround job. It's a job that has a country with still incredibly good underlying factors. We're still a country that feeds 40 million people around the world more sustainably than any other country. We have incredible people. We have a history of doing great things, an emerging tech sector, everything to play for, but we are totally underselling on our potential. So Chris Luxon and I believe that we're going to have to be very clear in the targets we set, in the accountability we expect from public agencies, for delivering on those targets and for returning discipline so that we actually extract maximum value for the government spending that has to occur.
Your to-do list would be pretty long. If you are elected, what's the priority? Where do you start with trying to do that turnaround?
Well, my view is you always have to start with your major asset, and that is our people. And I feel, as I talk to New Zealanders, that people are very ground down by the current economic conditions. Not only the fact that prices are running laps around their wages, but also as they look to the future, they see increasing interest rates, they see economic uncertainty, and they really need a boost of confidence. So we will prioritise tax reduction to increase real incomes, but we will do that while setting strong foundations in the economy and, as I said, very strong targets for public services. What we're also committed to doing, because we think in this election people will be sceptical of large promises of the 100,000 Kiwi build houses variety, so we will be setting out our plan for our first 100 days in office with the concrete commitments we intend to meet, because we think New Zealanders want their leaders to be held accountable, and we will be held accountable to those commitments.
One of the things you mentioned earlier was you talked about you can't control the sea, but you can control the direction of the ship as it sails. And I want to talk to you a little bit about your backstory, because probably there's a few people in this room who won't know this about you, but I know that you've worked under Sir John Key and under Sir Bill English a lot throughout their time, guiding the country through the choppy seas of, the GFC, the Christchurch earthquakes. What did you learn during your time working with those two?
I think the big thing I learnt from watching John Key and Bill English respond to the financial crisis was that actually you've got to give New Zealanders credit, that if you set out for them the circumstances that you are managing and the trade-offs you are making and the why you're prioritising what you're prioritising, New Zealanders will come along And what we saw under the last national government was, yes, an absolute commitment during the most difficult times of the GFC to using the Crown balance sheet to ensure that the economy kept going with the spending that required, but then also a crystal clear commitment that they would rein in spending, they would ensure that path back to surplus and that path to paying down debt. The government could be trusted to do what it said it would. And I think that's a fundamental part of ensuring and sustaining the trust of New Zealanders.
How much of, I guess, what you absorbed or learnt during that time plays out today in you as a politician?
Oh, look, a lot. I still talk with both John and Bill. I think they are very careful to make sure that there's space, because we face different challenges today than they faced. And I, of course, bring a different perspective from a different generation to those challenges. But I never forget the first conversation I ever had with Bill English, which was when I was a young woman in my 20s, starting as a researcher in his office. He was at that time, he'd just lost the leadership of the National Party. He was the opposition education spokesman. And I think he sensed that I thought he was yesterday's man. So he addressed that in his southern way. And he said, Nicola, you may think that having lost the confidence of my caucus, that you've hitched your wagon to yesterday's man. But let me be clear. Politics is not about personal ambition. It is not about the status you achieve or the role titles you're given. It is about the difference you make for other people. So hold yourself to that.
One of the things I think that Sir Bill English brought through, and touching on what you've just said there, it's about other people, was his big hope for his social investment policy and the amount of time that he'd invested in collating the data and to find out where. I remember interviewing him and he said, where am I going to get my best bang for a buck? And he talked about social investment, for example, if you have a 15-year-old girl who arrives in the system pregnant, is it then that you have to wrap around her, and be investing in her education, her parenting skills, where's she going to go to university, and developing her? And he said he wanted to know, rather than being, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. He was poised, I think, to introduce that 2 elections ago before he lost. I've heard Christopher Luxon refer to the social investment policy and what Sir Bill English was trying to do. Will that play out if you're elected? Do you think you'll lean into some of what Sir Bill was trying to achieve?
Absolutely. Look, when Simon Bridges announced he was leaving Parliament and Chris asked me to be the finance spokesperson, just about the first thing I said was, but I have to keep social investment because it's very important to me. And I think what social investment really is about answering is a concern that New Zealanders from all walks of life raise with me, which is, do we genuinely have social mobility in this country? That is it still true that no matter which family you were born to, you still have a chance of rising above whatever circumstances they are in? And increasingly the answer has felt like no, and I think there's been this binary debate where the left is seen as wanting to spend money and the right is sort of saying, let's pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Actually, neither are correct. The space is in the middle, which is it's not enough to spend money. You actually have to target the interventions that change people's lives. And today, in 2022, with the data we have, the insights we have, the research, the evidence, we are better placed than ever to know what those interventions are. The challenge is to reorganise the way we fund our public services and the way we approach budget bids to make sure the dollars go where we get the most value and genuinely get into the families and the homes that need it.
At the moment, we've got quite a few dollars going into Aotearoa and about 50 motels there at the moment. Inequality is growing. I know National first started to place people who needed state housing into motels, and then it's really escalated from there. And, certainly National's been criticised for selling off state housing in the past. I think most people would say, what does life start with? And it starts with a home. So what can you do to address this massive financial burden and the fact that we've got, I don't know, how many families have we got at the moment living in motels around New Zealand?
Well, last night, around 4,000 families put their children to bed in a motel room.
How do you address that?
Well, look, it's an issue that's very close to my heart. I was our housing spokesperson prior to this role, and watching housing affordability in New Zealand spin completely out of control, I think has been upsetting to many of us. I think the thing that's really frustrating is that Labor promised to solve it, but didn't actually come with tools for doing that. And what we've seen is that State House waiting list you refer to has quadrupled. There are far more people on it. And I think what we have to do is we have to accept that solving housing doesn't come with a silver bullet solution. It is multiple things. So yes, we have to get the planning laws right and the infrastructure funding right so that people are incentivised to grow our cities and build more houses. We have to get the Building Act and the regulations right. We actually have to support a thriving rental sector because, you know, with rents having gone up $140 a week since Labor came to office, that's pushing more people onto the State House waiting list. And we can't look at this as a problem for government to solve alone. It must partner with community housing organisations, with the private sector who are eager to do things like build-to-rent development. They just need a few regulatory tweaks along the way. I think if we're concerted in our efforts, we can make real progress on housing, but it's just a bit more complicated than, as I said, saying we'll build 100,000 Kiwi build houses.
It is difficult when you think about, you know, I interview a CEO on my program each morning, and all of them will say our biggest issue is access to labour. But when I look at the housing issues we've got in New Zealand, and I think, gosh, if we were to try and get those immigration numbers back up to where they were pre-COVID, then surely wouldn't our housing issues be exacerbated even more, do you think?
Well, look, I'm never one of those people who says let's have open slather immigration. I think immigration should be targeted so that it works for us as New Zealanders. However, if we are honest about our situation right now, we are losing people. We are losing more people overseas than we are gaining. So we're not actually in a situation where we're debating more people coming in to grow the population. We are genuinely debating how do we replace the skilled workers who are leaving.
Okay, I want to bury down to some other issues in particular. I want to talk to you a little bit about Kiwisaver and that U-turn on GST on Kiwisaver fees. On the face of it, I think some people would suggest it makes sense. It was perhaps just communicated in a poor way and was obviously going to impact New Zealanders along the way. National First halved the contributions to Kiwisaver. Would National look to tinker with Kiwisaver again, do you think?
Well, we've made a crystal clear commitment, and let me make it to this room again, because I know that there are lots of people in this room who really want to see Kiwisaver succeed. We are not going to change the settings for Kiwisaver in any way that could reduce or threaten New Zealanders' savings. We've made that commitment that Kiwisaver is safe with us. If anything, it's the other side of it. It's what are the sensible things that we could do to encourage more people to either join Kiwisaver or increase their contributions.
I want to talk to you too about climate change policy as well. And it was interesting watching in Australia the rise of the Teals, a number of women in roles where they supported the capitalist model that National would, sit with, but also, particularly in Australia, we're very adamant that it shouldn't be at the expense of the planet. Where does National sit? And is this an area that potentially National may be wanting in its approach to what is, if you listen to the Prime Minister, the nuclear issue of our generation?
Well, look, I should probably be more diplomatic about our Australian friends. But actually, I think this is an issue that illustrates how the Liberal Party in Australia got it wrong and the National Party in New Zealand has got it right. Because actually at several critical junctures, and National has made what has sometimes been the hard decision to lean towards climate change action, whether that was signing up to the Paris Agreement and the targets that came with it, whether that was our decision in the last Parliament to support the Zero Carbon Act, to support the Climate Change Commission, to support the Emissions Trading Scheme. And actually this year, Chris Luxon and I have signed up to the emissions reduction budget set by the government. And we've done that for the very clear reason that we believe responding to climate change is both a moral imperative, but also a trading and economic imperative for a country like New Zealand that makes its way in the world on its ability to trade and export. And we see for the people in this room and outside it that having certainty about the Crown's commitment to emission reduction allows you to plan and manage risk more effectively. So we are absolutely committed to stability there. And Rachel, look, I'd just say, I'm proudly a blue-green. I believe that a strong economy allows us to better protect the environment. It is not a or situation, it's an and situation.
It feels at times, though, our approach to addressing climate change involves not necessarily heavily targeting the reduction of emissions, but more countering them. And I say that when we look at, I'm from a rural background in the South Island, and I look at the number of pine trees that are going in productive land, and it seems like a very short-term measure. What's National's position on that?
Well, look, there is a real tension there because, of course, what we want to be seeing is people decarbonising energy production and their industries alongside those offsetting measures such as afforestation. It's always interesting because I spend a lot of time with farming communities and they share your concern about forestry, and I remind them we still have less forestry than we did at other periods in our history. But what I think is important is that we both allow for other forms of carbon offset, whether it's blue ocean offsets, whether it's carbon capture and storage, but also that we ensure that we are getting big changes in those big sectors. I've got a lot of optimism about what's possible with renewable energy and how we can increase generation there, about how we can electrify our car fleet and some of the alternatives that are popping up around hydrogen and our other fleets. So we have to do both.
Okay, I want to talk about geopolitics as well, because you mentioned again, you can't control the sea, and the sea's pretty blimmin' choppy at the moment, I have to say.
Yeah.
Particularly around areas, the South Pacific and China's role in there, but also up in Ukraine. I mean, the government has engaged. We are training, we've sent soldiers across to the UK to train Ukrainians. We've sent some money across as well for potentially lethal aid. What would National's stance be on Ukraine? It does feel like that situation is going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, look, this is an area I know I've made some partisan comments today. So here you go. This is a bipartisan thing where I think actually the way the government has been handling this to date is in the right place. I think New Zealanders feel a strong moral connection to what's happening in Ukraine. Where I live in Karori in Wellington, we've got the Russian embassy. And every weekend, when we drive past taking the kids back from sport, there's this young man, he'd only be 12 or 13, holding a sign saying, "Remember Ukraine." And I tell you, every car that goes past beeps for him. And that's about our sense of New Zealand values and identity. And part of that is speaking up for what's right on the world stage and working alongside our partners to contribute effectively to peace in the world. So long may that continue.
So when we use our voice in that way with Ukraine, what about China? Because there are issues going on in the South Pacific. There are other human rights issues within China as well. They're standing, we think, shoulder to shoulder with Russia. How do we balance that trade relationship along with that geopolitical issue with China?
Well, as you acknowledge, New Zealand has a long-standing and deep relationship with China. Both a trading relationship, but also a people-to-people relationship, a diplomatic relationship, a cultural relationship. Within a relationship like that, we have to be able to raise our concerns about what is happening in China. I don't think anyone can read about the situation in Xinjiang province, the plight of Uyghurs, and not feel that that's something that New Zealand should speak up about when we have the opportunity. And I do think that needs to continue. Parliament's actually been quite unanimous in that view, and I think that's strong. I acknowledge the importance of the trading relationship, but I don't think that should preclude us staying true to our values and principles.
Okay, when you talk about values and principles, we're just nearing the end of our chat here, but I want to get a little bit more insight into Christopher Luxon, because there's a man that we know as the former CEO of Air New Zealand, and we've seen him increasingly in the media and increasingly sort of building on becoming the politician. Tell us about what you know behind the scenes about him, both as an individual and as a leader.
Yeah, well, look, if I had one word to sum up Chris, it would be integrity. He really is one of those people who does what he says and believes what he says and acts behind closed doors as he would act on the stage. And for me, as his colleague, that has been enormous, because when you have a leader with great integrity, that actually brings integrity to the team. And what I've seen him do with our team is really identify people's strengths and provide them opportunities to play to them. And that's just so important. We've got a tiny caucus. We got a terrible result at the election. There's only 33 of us. And when you're punching with that smaller team, you need everyone cooking with gas. And Chris has brought us together in a way that has allowed that to happen. And I see in him, as I say, a leader with integrity, and fundamentally a leader who will get things done. And I think that's what New Zealand needs right now.
It'll be a pretty gnarly run into the election at the end of next year. Has he got the thick enough skin? I mean, politics is a pretty hard beast to find yourself at the coalface of, fighting that fight, and it will be a closely fought election. Do you think he's got the thick enough skin to cope with that?
Absolutely. I see in him that glint in his eye, which is that he really believes that with the right leadership, New Zealand can be a much better place, and he wants to deliver that. And when you've got that sense of purpose and you've got that clarity of mission, you can take a lot of knocks.
Just finally, Grant Robertson, when he spoke to this audience yesterday, he said that he felt very optimistic for the future. What do you see?
Yeah, I think there's much to be optimistic about in New Zealand's future. As I said, we're a country that can feed the world, we can do it sustainably, we have the potential to grow our tech sector, but we've also got some big problems and we need to front up to them. What's the best indicator of the productivity of this economy in 20 years? It's what's happening in our classrooms today. So we all need to be really worried that a lot of those classrooms don't have kids regularly attending, and many children aren't achieving the literacy and numeracy standards that New Zealand children were achieving in past generations. So we have to front up to those issues. We have to be focused on performance. We have to be focused on standards. And that requires government that, as I say, will set targets, hold itself accountable, and deliver value.
Nicola Willis, Deputy National Leader, thank you so much.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, everyone. And kia ora, Nicola. On behalf of the FSC board and all the delegates here, I'd just like to thank you for being here this morning, joining us here at the conference. It's our first in-person conference in 3 years, and it's certainly great to have our guest speakers in the room with us. I know there's a lot of people in the room who've been burning the midnight oils on the implementation of various regulations that have come our sector's way over the last couple of years. I also know there's a lot of people who have provided feedback and worked on New Zealand income insurance schemes. So I know that your thoughts on those, the clarity that you brought to those, will be much appreciated. What really resonated with me personally was hearing you speak about your desire to work alongside industry. All of us here in the room, I think, want to build a more prosperous, a more resilient, and a more sustainable New Zealand. And to do so is absolutely going to require all parts of New Zealand, government, public sector, and the private sector to work towards that common goal. And so I just want to say on behalf of the FSC, on behalf of the board, and the companies that we represent, our doors are open. And we look forward to the continuing engagement with yourself and your colleagues and your peers right across Parliament, because it's going to take significant engagement. It's going to take all hands on the till to get that ship through the seas that we're heading towards. So thank you again. Tēnā koe.